Terry, how are you doing today? What's going on? What's going on?
Not much. I'm here with you. What's going on with you?
You know, um, far too much for the limited brain capacity that I have. There's only so much bandwidth, and I think maybe I made lifetime decisions that are not going well.
Like going back
Maybe
to school?
that was a lifetime decision. It's going well. It's just it's draining parts of my energy stream. There's all kinds of bad metaphors, but um, hopefully the end part of it will be worth the beginning part of it. Let's put it that way.
I mean, I made bad lifetime decisions too. I rooted for two teams who got ultimately decimated this weekend. So, as a
So
sports guy, I'm a sports ball guy. We all know this. It's just
right.
painful.
On behalf
Just
of a
painful.
resident sports ball fan in my house that you particularly appreciate, he wants to make a statement. I had it written down just in case of a possible opportunity to all fans of the safety school in Ohio, otherwise known as Ohio State. Go Ducks.
The quack attack. Listen, that was one of the beautiful things of the weekend for me that made me very happy. It's a couple things. I mean, my team's lost, but seeing Arkansas just kill Texas made me smile. And seeing Oregon knock off Ohio State made me smile. And then last night, I mean, the medicine I needed was the Manning brothers in their Monday Night Football broadcast. It was just fantastic to watch Peyton and Eli roast each other and just totally. You know what it was last night? I feel like we've been robbed. They kind of stole what we do, except for they're watching the game together and they're just sitting there, kind of chilling out, watching the game and just talking, kind of like you and I do. And I think it's pretty funny. So maybe they owe us some royalties on that.
Yeah, I think I want a nickel, and then for Terry, probably wants like a signed jersey or football because that's what he does.
No, I just want to go on the show one time with the two of them. I want to be one of their guests. That's all I want. I don't care about any memorabilia. I mean, I got memorabilia, but if they want to give it, that'd be great. But I would just love to go on the show with them one time. That would be hilarious to sit and watch football with Peyton and Eli. It'd be fantastic.
This is where I can insert a football reference that I can throw in here that actually is cogent to our conversation. John Madden's kids went to my high school before I was there, and he used to sometimes in the preseason show up at practice, and he had been talking to some of the staff and had made some suggestions. And the previous head coach of our team, not Coach Sweeney, who was the coach when I was there, told him to get off the field, and he had no idea what he was doing.
That's pretty funny.
Just a little bit later, one of the assistants came over and said, "You realize who that was?" There was much apology taking place at that point. We just got to be careful about what kind of influences we let into our field and some that we exclude from our field.
Oh, look at the
segue.
It's almost like you know what you're doing on this thing.
Not really. But that is kind of our topic for today. There's a lot of salient points that have happened over the past week since Terry and I talked last week that I think are important. A number of us, probably particularly those who preach in our age bracket, have been thinking often about conversations and encouragement they've received from D. Bowman over the years, but not just that. And so it's not just a narrow thing, but the core of our conversation today is what about your influences? And I want to encourage folks to think outside of the mentor-mentee aspect. Think outside of exclusively those who preach towards those who preach, and vice versa, and really open up the table and think about what's pushing on us, what's driving on us. And so that's kind of the core subject matter for today. And Terry's going to bring out much more whiteboard use and some good color commentary, and be a good.
I should get a whiteboard. That would be great. I should get like a little marker board, and I should draw some diagrams, some plays for you.
Yeah.
Maybe next week. Maybe.
Like
I mean, we know that all
church building.
No,
talk
we'd have to
about
start in the
student
garden because
approach.
it all goes back to the garden. I
Well,
mean,
yeah,
and speaking
but
of influences,
the garden is a temple, and the temple is the church, and so we could just superimpose those. We can get an artist to layer those out like a sandwich. Nice word sandwich there for you. It's
yeah.
good to have some of the folks showing up. Mark and Hal and Chris so far have jumped in the conversation.
Look, this is a great episode. We're 5 minutes in. We've had a John Madden reference, a Telestrator reference, a Peyton Manning and Eli Manning reference. We're doing great. This is my kind of broadcast. So,
Yeah.
I mean, talking about influences, obviously sports is one of mine. I think it's interesting, though, when you think about how the world influences us. And I think this is true, by the way, Phil, for everybody. But, we specifically tend to focus on preachers and so forth. One of the things that influences us is our hobbies and the things that we get involved in. So for me, it may be sports. For you, it's more outdoors stuff sometimes. And what I mean by that is it influences our mind to think about things in different ways, our illustrations. And that's a very low level, shallow way to start this. But you can see that. One of the things I learned a long time ago is I had to be careful about using too many sports illustrations in my sermons because of how big of an influence that is in my life. Even though there's other things I like. So just that simple way to understand it is those things have a profound way of kind of affecting you and changing the way you think. Another thing I can tell you is that I used to be influenced by everything going on in the world. If I go back and I read a lot of my previous bulletin articles, I'm amazed at how many of those were so specifically tied to some event or news story or even some kind of thing that week. It's kind of overwhelming to see how I let those things kind of sway the direction I'm going in. And so those are a couple of ways to just point out how just the world we live in has a profound influence on us. If in ways I think we don't think of in the current moment. I think that's one of the things too, is when I'm writing those articles, give a good example of that. Two sermons that stand out in mind that were clearly influenced by popular culture. One of them was everybody almost preached a lesson about the DaVinci Code when the movie came out. Yep, me too. And everybody probably dealt with in some way, whether it was an article or a sermon, when Discovery came out with saying they had found the tomb of Jesus, and he had this whole family with Mary. If you remember that whole thing,
Yep.
We all were like, "Oh, we got to jump on that, and we got to address that." Those things influenced us greatly in our preaching, and I look back at that. One of the things I prefer to do with my preaching is to preach lessons that have great recurring usages of it. Those two, there's a lot of effort for things that, by the way, looking back, they had zero impact on faith in our of people. Like almost nobody viewed Dan Brown's books as faith challenging as we thought they were at the time, and nobody viewed that Discovery special as being faith challenging, and yet we were convinced it was. It's just interesting how those things kind of navigated us through certain moments of our life, and we all responded to those influences.
Yeah, and since we're talking about influences here, let me go a straight up shill. We're no longer putting this on personal pages. I'm not putting it on mine. Terry doesn't put it on his. So if you like it on the Do the Work page. If you like what we're talking about today, share today's conversation. Comment if you have better thoughts than ours, and careful because I might send you a link and invite you into the video feed. So you want to make sure you're prepared for that too. But like my sermon, Decoding the DaVinci Code, should have been destroyed. When they all found the tomb, I did an expository lesson about the textual stuff there with a little light commentary on it. That's probably a more mature response than I would have done before, and I got lucky on that one. I was like, hey, you made a good choice because of accidents.
Yeah.
But I think about it this way. Let's talk briefly, because I think it's important, about D. Bowman's influence on gospel preachers. Almost every gospel preacher I know personally has read nearly everything he wrote. Whether they were all on board with his work or distant, not close to him personally. Most of the ones I know, and I can say that as a general sense, have read everything he wrote. But I think about the lessons that I've personally been at. The very first gospel sermon I heard as a part of a gospel meeting was one that Dee preached. And I will tell you from the standpoint of, you make these unethical comparisons of yourselves to others. That wasn't a good opportunity for a young guy who wanted to preach to create a standard by. Because in my head, I will never exceed the influence that seasoned lesson had on me, an unseasoned lump of potential. And over those years, I think I've probably heard Dee in person 10 times preach, just because of where I've lived and where he's been and where those meetings have taken place. And every single time, it was far more competent from the pulpit than most of what I would hear in every other setting. And so I think on a positive level, that's a legacy that is something worthy of consideration and generally a good influence.
Look, all of us have been influenced by his preaching style, I think, because even though we'll never be D. Bowman and we should never really try, that should not be our goal. I know at least for me, I speak in triads a lot when I'm preaching, and I learned that. A lot of guys have done that, but nobody did it better than D. Bowman. And I can give you an illustration. D. Bowman had a fantastic vocabulary. If I tried to, and Phil could get away with this more than me, but if I try to use some of the words that D did, everybody would laugh because I'm just a Southern bumpkin from, Tennessee. Like, that doesn't fit my personality, and I know that. But the reason D got away with that, not only is because it was his personality, but because he always sandwiched that with two other things that you understood. You were never lost because of his vocabulary. And that was one of the things early on I was shown by my mentor and you end up doing that all the time. There's D. Bowman is in all of us when we use those kinds of triads and do those kind of things. We've read Common Sense Preaching, most of us. That's influenced all of us. So at the end of the day, he's really, but let me tell you the way D. Bowman influenced me more than anything else, more than his preaching, anything else. And this is just when I thought about D last week. Every time I saw D. Bowman, he knew who I was. He asked how I was doing, and he made positive comments about me, about my work. Every time I was around D. Bowman, it did not matter where I was, he invested in me. And that was true when I was 25 years old and would run into him, or when I was 40. And it's just, there's very few people in my life who were able to do that. I always wondered if he had an earwig and somebody was saying, that's Terry Francis preaches in Tennessee, because he knew you. I don't know if you had that same, experience, Phil, but once he knew you the first time, he knew you and he loved you. D. Bowman made you feel loved. And that's one of the things that always will stand out in my mind. And as a preacher, that was really, really valuable to me, and still is.
Yeah, I'll kind of just to segue back to the core of our subject, because it's really not just about D. I think he's a good illustration of things. It's very easy to be cynical about how someone behaves in that regard. Oh, he doesn't really mean it. But the reality is the full spectrum of experiences have shown that he actually cared. This was not a thing that he just put on the surface.
Well, look at the comments. I mean, Jeremy and Hal had the same. Everybody had the same experience.
Yeah, he
literally. Well, he knew he could influence you. He knew he could. I think D. Bowman knew the influence he had on all of us, and he did that not because he was D. Bowman, but he did that. I'm convinced for the glory of God. By the way, I'm totally convinced by that.
And I'll add that he did that with people who, on the surface at least, did not like him. And I've seen it. I've watched it with my own eyes. And so, that level of commitment is an influence worthy of noting. And you acknowledge all the imperfections. You know, those are all things that they could certainly be explored in any individual's life. Let me make a little quick connection here, because I want to get back to the core of our show, unless others want to bring up some, you know, additional good questions, comments, I'm sure is there. Hal brought up this, and he's talking about timely relevance in the moment in regards to cultural influences. And absolutely, that's the case. I think it's really important to learn in the development of your preaching to create a gated entry for ideas, where you give them the space. There's a lot of different ways in which our influences can be categorized. And one of the ones I've experienced recently, and I think it's a good way to think about it, is simply a series of concentric rings. And ideas and concepts that are farther from our intimate close circle live in these larger spaces. Not every one of those ideas needs to fully jump into the next level of participation in our preaching and our teaching. Terry and I have both kind of been walking through, and I think Terry's a little further in the series than I am, a podcast series that deals specifically with the influence of Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill Church on evangelicalism, theology, Baptist churches, megachurch culture in the U.S.
It's called the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, by the way.
Yeah. Excellent adult level podcast. I think there's value to it in the younger age brackets, but parents, take the time to pre-screen that to determine if that's the
some of the later episodes. The last episode you don't want to listen to with your kids, just to be honest with you. There's a lot of things there that you don't want to do there, but so it ties directly to what we're talking about here. Driscoll's influenced, and you get a window into a different perspective.
Right. So this is kind of where this has come from. As I'm listening to this, I'm seeing pieces of myself in any of these relationships explored, because generationally, I'm at the same age point that most of the participants in this story are at. Experientially, I do not come from a Christian home per se. We didn't go to church growing up as a child, and so some of Mark's early experiences are like bookended with mine. Like, okay, that's experience there. But also in congregational contexts, some of the conversations, I've been on the receiving end of some of the things that have taken place. I've been in the middle space. It's very likely I've been on the poor behavior edge of the table, or at least the enabling side of those things. And so it really lays bare simple truths about influences. And one of the things that really sparked my interest is talking about Driscoll's commentary about his solid influences stylistically for his speaking. And he actually is attributed to lean into the style of individuals like Chris Rock, Howard Stern. And aside from the vulgarity, stylistically, it's rough, it's abrupt, it's gruff. Often
he's a shock jock. He's a shock
very
jock.
Much, like, and if you don't know that term, you kind of have to pull it in there. But it's very obvious.
Yeah, shock jock goes back to really Howard Stern. Really, kind of, I think, coined that term. Jock meaning disc jockey from the radio. And listen, he's extremely abrasive. And I can't help but think, by the way, even just a quick contrast of the two worlds we're connecting a little bit. One of them, D on one end and Driscoll on the other, because the other thing you see is Driscoll becomes an influencer within his congregation. And just the impact and contrast between the way D. Bowman impacted people and handled that versus the way Mark Driscoll impacted people and handled that could not be further apart in all of this. But what drove that is what you're getting at, is that, and Edwin calls it celebrity personality preaching. It is. I'll tell you, when I think of Driscoll and I hear excerpts of Driscoll, Driscoll's like the WWE of megachurch pastors. I mean, I think that's the best way to describe him. He gets up there, he says a lot of things that are edgy and in your face, and he doesn't care. And he'll talk about times about driving the Mars Hill bus over people. He'll talk about cutting people. I mean, he's just very aggressive and abrasive. And that's because he allowed things to influence him, and that's what he wanted to be. Let me tell you something. There was a time in my life, I think, where I was headed down that same path, where I kind of took pleasure in kind of being the rebel in the pulpit, to saying things in a way that nobody else would say them. And, to get away with saying things that were so edgy that it made people blush. And with maturity, I think I've moved out of that. But that personality style preaching is also what develops a culture around the guy in the pulpit more than the Word of God. That's really the danger of that. And so anyway, I think it's really interesting just to see that and to recognize you can be that if you're not careful. And that's one of the wake-up calls for me, Phil, in all of that. But
yeah, I want to concur with Edwin. I brought Edwin's comment up. I've been reading some complimentary texts to this story that Terry and I have been talking about. And let me give a quick highlight of that, and to tie why I would kind of say that, none of us are immune to this. Like, I'm not immune to it. The story of Mars Hill connects to the story of Robert Schuller, which connects to the story of, nearly every Bill Hybels, all of the mega church model, Rick Warren. We could include Max Lucado or Lucado, depending on what your mood is today. Streams of influence and stylistic, kind of certainly not plagiarism, but overarching influence. Although I think in some cases there is intentional, I'm going to do it like this guy behavior that takes place. So, thinking through how all of this impacts the message that makes it out of your mouth, that's a really big thing. And I'm going to add, and Terry and I talked about this ahead of time, this is not just about politics, but how many times have you been either the giver of information or the hearer of information, and stylistically it sounds like Rush Limbaugh or Rachel Maddow or Bill Maher, or
Ingram,
pick someone on the spectrum, or Crazy Conspiracy Boy. I didn't mention Jared Saltz, but I'm going to say Jared Saltz because he's textual crazy conspiracy guy, so we can put him in the edge and say he's the biblical alien finder. And it's just my feelings about Hebrew as an alien.
Hebrew QAnon, Jared Schultz.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone's excited about that. But really, you think about that. But the way in which we bring those influences in to our message, and what are we modeling? Something that's fundamental about leadership is that whether it's functioning well or not, you do eventually become like your leaders. If your leadership methodology and the core of their character isn't in step with the core of their message, you're still adopting both of those things. And you end up with some sort of bipolar outcome. Or I've seen this kind of leadership, but the message from their hearts is this kind of, outcome. And so you end up with this two competing streams. And I think it's really super valuable for those who are sitting down to craft their sermons, craft out their preaching plan, respond to what they believe is necessary in the local church this week, in regards to the sermon for next week, to think through and say, okay, what's the lasting goal I have here? What do I really need to emphasize?
Yeah.
And look at Chris talks about Star Wars references. I intentionally have to curtail taco and canoeing references as a state. I can't use them as much as I would otherwise. I just can't. It's not a healthy balance.
Well, I think the thing that this is one of those, I'm going to misapply a text probably here. That's okay.
You're good at misapplying text, right?
Yeah,
that's your thing.
That's my thing today. the idea that Paul became all things to all people, when you're preaching, you've got to be careful that you don't just focus on the one group of people, whether it's sports fans or Star Wars fans or canoeing or taco people or whatever. You got to provide a balanced approach to all of that. And that's a challenge for us, I think, sometimes, not to get so pigeonholed in our illustrations and our references. So there's the Lord of the Rings comment we knew was coming, and I'm going to ignore that. And I think I didn't get in on Hal's question. Let me go back to that real quick. Relevance is relevance, and there's a time and place for relevance, and I think that's kind of what you were saying, Phil. I think sometimes, though, there's things that we think are relevant, and they're really not, and that's the challenge in figuring all of that out. So not on this podcast, he does not.
See, here's the thing. You see the X amount of volume, you hear this statement, both of these things can be true. Yes,
by the way, I think people don't realize how much you would talk about those two things if you weren't curtailing it. That's the bigger message. It's kind of like Edwin with Lord of the Rings. Like, Edwin is curtailing his Lord of the Rings comments. He averages one a broadcast when he's a spectator here. That's better than the 15 he wants to give. So it's one of those deals where that actually is curtailing. So,
yeah. Hey, look, if you're going to have a hobby, pick one or two and become really good at them.
Just one or two.
Yeah. Anyway, thinking about this on a practical level, we can talk about influences in the mentor-mentee space. We can talk about influences in our reading space. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize as we kind of put idea to speech and idea to paper is to think about what the next step looks like. If I adopt this methodology, this mindset, this conceptual package that I just read about or I just experienced, and I share it with the people who matter most to me, my family in Christ, what's that going to look like? Whether it's the super edgy shock jock approach, or if I see success because Stephen Furtick, I'll move into another area of the evangelical, is super popular. So that means I've got to wear super expensive clothes, work out to the point where I'm at the peak capacity for my physical abilities. And, I do that. Or I see D. Bowman behave a way. And rather than adopt it because it's the character of a person, but adopt it because I see it being successful, because that's what happens with each of our three different things. What's the outcome? Like, the outcome is, on the surface, well, it looks like if you do the D. Bowman route, things going great. If you come back to these other two models, people will go, because they're only seeing the outside. What's in the middle of a man, his heart, actually matters. And as Bob McPherson, comments there, it does matter when it's authentic.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, you think about like Bowman. Bowman was a sharp dresser, man. He was well put together. And then my buddy Keith Stonehart's in jeans and a untucked shirt and tie half the time. And you know what makes that great is that's who those two guys were, like, and are. That's their personalities. And to Bob's point, that's their authenticity. And Keith doesn't need to go out and dress like D. Bowman, and D. Bowman doesn't need to go dress like Keith just to try to approach a certain crowd. You be who you are and be authentic at the end of the day. That's one of the things I loved about.
I can't visualize
D in a pair of jeans.
No, it's a mohawk.
Look, let me tell you something.
I got nothing.
Shane Scott's listening, and I'll never forget that Bubba Gardner, classmate of ours, co-worker of D forever, it feels like, since he started preaching. Bubba walks up to me and Shane, who were talking, and Bubba at Witt's lectures, me and Shane are dressed down comfortable. Bubba's in like a cufflink shirt with the sleeves rolled up, probably, in a tie, very much the D kind of, model. And I'll never forget, Shane Scott goes right there. He's like, Terry, he's like, D and Bubba, those are those guys that mow their yard in cufflinks. You know what I'm saying? And I mean, it's just kind of funny because that's who they were. That's just their personality. That's who they are at the end of the day. That's not who Shane and I are. Shane and I aren't going to tuck our shirt in for nobody unless we have to.
Right. And to put it into some more practical context, for Bubba, that's how he was in college. Like that wasn't a shift for him.
Bubba didn't become little D. He already was.
Before those doors opened and that relationship began, Bubba was already that way. So Clint Springer, my mother-in-law's adoptive dad, tremendous guy. Clint had a lot of great things to him. Jill and I had just gotten married. We were going over to help at his house. I was literally there to clean out their storage shed for them. And so I showed up in jeans and was politely reminded that as an evangelist and a gospel preacher, I should not be wearing jeans. And I thanked him for his advice, and I cleaned out his storage shed and went about my day, because it was important to him, but it didn't match who I am. When in reality, I don't even really like wearing jeans that much. I was wearing them because they were the appropriate clothing for the task. It's what I owned.
Shorts,
I was broke.
Man. What are you talking about?
Well, you hadn't been in their storage shed. I was afraid of getting bit. So,
well, and Edwin brings
a layer of thick protection.
By the way, Edwin brings up Ed Harrell, who we also lost in the last year, and Ed's completely different, highly influenced a lot of us. So, just gonna ignore that comment.
Yeah.
Edwin is making up, by the way, this week for missing last week. Have you noticed that?
Yeah,
he's completely
this
made
is
up
actually,
for that.
I think, average output. I don't think this is
I don't know. He seems a little bit tuned in today. Anyway, again, Ed Harrell, I mean, tremendous influence on me in the time I got to spend with Ed. And I was blessed to spend some time in some small group kind of eating together interactions with both Ed and Dee that, by the way, were just treasures when you look back on them. Those guys, just in their personal, you sit down with them, the stories they could tell, the way they talk to you, fantastic. But we don't want this to be a tribute show, but those guys are greatly missed for sure. So
let me kind of make a quick application point space for those who are going to be in leadership roles: preaching, teaching, shepherding, deaconing. Start thinking through what level of practical transparency is going to take place when you take any level of influence and then filter it through whom you are right now and share it to the next generation. Those influences are strong, and more powerful people will probably push through the lens of ourselves in a stronger way. I think it's really important to think through it and realize that each of these personalities, and this is something what Chris is kind of bringing up as well, have a space in the kingdom.
Right.
They've got a place, but what we're talking as a concern space here is that there is some very toxic distortions that culture produces that also are present in local churches and that can also be present in our hearts, that we've got to come to grips with if we truly want to be the model that God needs us to be. Like, I think there's part of that tension between acknowledging good influences and negative influences is to think about how that tension plays out in our lives.
Don't you think one of the things you learn from Driscoll, and when we let influences push us in the wrong direction, for me in my life where I've made bad decisions, it's because the focus is wrong. I think that's specifically true with Driscoll. The focus is not so much about just sharing the gospel, and that's what our mission is. The focus becomes about growth of not the kingdom, but growth of the specific congregation. And it becomes about growing one's influence. With Driscoll, what's really interesting to see is his change. And look, there's so many layers to the Mars Hill problem, but Driscoll early on criticized people who allowed themselves to become the focal point of a work, and by the end of it, Driscoll was telling people he was the brand of Mars Hill, and that shift in focus and change in mindset is what often is what I'm getting at. Actually, drives us to the wrong influences, because we look at what we think works out there, whether it's Howard Stern or I use the WWE reference or whatever, and we go, well, this is the way to get to where I want to get. And because getting where I want to get is this form of success that is, I want to say extra biblical, but really non-biblical, which is church growth, mega church, that kind of stuff, selling books, all the power stuff, because that's my focus. And I basically tune into every form of marketing and everything I can to influence me to increase that. What happens is I let bad influences, to sum this my rant up, I let bad influences direct me to change who I am, what I do, how I do it, because I have the wrong priorities to begin with. I'm not understanding that I'm just a servant, that God is the focus, that the kingdom is the focus, that sharing the gospel is the focus. And, that's reflected, I think, in really what Chris is saying here, that preaching the gospel is what's important. And regardless of as long as we're not doing that in a way that abuses and perverts the gospel, regardless of how we do that, the gospel's still being preached, and we should appreciate that and not be driven to do things in the wrong way. Largely, I'm going to say all that to really say pride is what drives that. Pride is really behind all the things I talked about, and it's pride, a self-seeking pride. Yeah, pride and envy.
Jealousy comes in the space between those two things, and so I want to reframe, or at least shorten down, Chris's excellent commentary question here. It's a larger thing, but only part of it fits on the screen, but it's worth kind of pausing on for a second. We very often who preach, I've already talked about one of the dangers that takes place. We create an imperfect, unbalanced standard, and we lift up a caricature of somebody else's success, and we say, I'll never be as good as that. Ergo, or because of that, I'm not any good at all. And so we make these two high-low spaces that neither of those things are true. A second thing we do in the same thing is we dismiss success, effectiveness in a given locality because of jealousy, pride, or whatever. And we say, yeah, but they're not actually successful, because they're not doing it the way that I would do it, or brother so-and-so would do it. So that means that the fruit that we can see is actually bad fruit. Like, it's not good fruit, it's bad fruit, because they wear a tie or don't wear a tie. They preach expository lessons or they preach topical lessons. They plan their sermons or they don't plan their sermons. And let me be specific about that, because theoretically on October the 12th, we may be just having a great conversation about preacher planning, sermon planning. What I'm talking about is planning ahead of time and kind of coordinating your thoughts through a longer period rather than actually writing out your sermon. Every good preacher I know writes out their sermon to some capacity or another. Those aren't actually judges of effectiveness. They're superficial tags we attach to things and say, boom, this is good, this is bad. Where the reality is, effectiveness in the kingdom is both objective and subjective. The objective side of it is really found in the halls of God's purview. Even though we might see the symptom of that God vision in the subjective space of our local churches. Because even with invested elders, when you talk to them about the growth of that congregation, they're making a little bit of a subjective evaluation. They could have 20 members in the flock, they could have 2,000 members in the flock, and they're still applying a subjective look at things. And personality matters. There are churches where someone with my personality are going to be absolutely ineffective in roles of preaching, teaching, and shepherding. And I want to tie one last thread together to the comment I put up earlier about Jeremy. A preacher has to reach a point where there's a good balance between who they are and who God needs them to be. Yeah. And for me, I noticed it when my wonderful sister-in-law made a comment after not hearing me preach for a little while. and she commented, "When did Philip start telling jokes in the pulpit?" And I don't know when that occurred, but I know for a long time I didn't use humor.
Wait.
Pulpit.
You use humor?
I do.
That's not allowed.
Yeah, I know, and I thought it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
had to
and
get
Shane's
comfortable with myself.
yeah, Shane's comment too that D said preaching is the gospel and personality, and that's why you need personalities. I mean, look, you and I are friends, but in the pulpit we're very different. We have different styles, but that goes back to our personalities. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and so much of that is true. And
You know,
Paul and
so,
Peter were very different, by the way, weren't they, Phil?
yeah. Oh, yeah. They you know, how about Paul and Barnabas?
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know, John Mark, Timothy. I mean, the Bible shows that diversity of approach as being effective.
and God uses all of those personalities in the Bible story.
Yeah. And so I really think this the core of this is to be mindful of that reality and reflective. A quality investigation of the subject should make it feel like you're kind of unveiling parts of yourself and you're thinking about where this came from and where I picked up this habit. Why do I do things this way? Some of them we can really nail down. I can tell you precisely why, if I make an appointment with someone, I will call them to ensure the appointment is going to take place. Or if someone says, "Hey, I'm going to call this place tomorrow on your behalf, and it's an important thing to me," I call and follow up. And that's a Fay Flat thing. One of the elders that served the church at Jay Whitson, like, look, I do that because he taught me that was important. And literally that behavior is masked because of his influence on me. And we need to be aware of that, because no matter what you think about your preaching ability, you literally are that person for somebody else somewhere else. And if you're not aware of it, you really ought to be. I think that's an important part of the puzzle.
Yeah, it drives me nuts, by the way, that I have Wilson Adams mannerisms sometimes when I preach. My wife laughs about it. You know, you can't help who influences you. That was my mentor. And so there's things I picked up I don't even realize I picked up. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. You're influenced by people, but then, and I think that's one of the great lessons from guys like D and Ed Harrell, not Edwin Crozier, Ed Harrell, is you also are going to influence other people. You're going to influence them. And so think about that as well. That's the counter side of what we've been talking about today.
Yeah. You know, it'll all be worth the process of consideration. And you very likely will look back and say, yeah, I need to reapproach this subject. I need to reapproach my method. Perhaps I've let any number of political, social, economic, cultural influences into my space, into my preaching, into my teaching, and they really shouldn't be there.
Yeah, when you start seeing things that influence your preaching that become more important than gospel, whether it's a political agenda or it's a social agenda or it's a response to something, like, I mean, just to Hal's questions really about relevance, you know, being relevant's one thing, but having every sermon driven by a news story the week of the sermon is something completely different. That might reveal to you you're being influenced too much by pop culture around you. Same with the bulletin articles or your Bible classes. And the other thing is, if you've been so influenced by personality that you've become greater than the message, that's a real problem, Phil. That's a real issue. That when you're and that's, you know, to the Driscoll thing, that was what happened. That the personality becoming the brand became more important than even the message at some point. And that was because of his influences, and that's one of the dangers there as well.
Yeah. And Chris kind of relates on the emotional side of things with a quick comment. You know, as people, generally speaking, we tend to want leaders who are like us, but then we also place on them higher expectations that they grow beyond where they came from. But don't forget where they came from. It's hard to balance. Sometimes that separates preachers from their congregations emotionally and socially. It's hard to get close to brethren because of those expectations of being one of them. You know, and that's part of that intertwining family goal in the relationship of an evangelist and the congregation. My mindset about that has also tried to shift a little bit and how to accomplish that. The goal of the evangelist is not only to be integrated into their local church as part of the family. The goal of the evangelist is to help the kingdom goal take place, which is the people in that local church, including the preacher, get integrated into the kingdom in the process of the relationship in the local church. And so the preaching has to be both local, but also have a line view of the horizon of heaven and help everyone see to get over those mountains toward heaven. And Paul Hammonds, it's okay. We took a break. We're back now. We're still doing this, but we took a little vacation over the summer. A little time apart for prayer. It builds relationships stronger. I read that somewhere. I'll take it out of context and make it apply here.
Well done.
Done. That's about 45 minutes, a little longer than normal, but I think it's a good introduction to things. As we mentioned before, we've got topics of importance coming up for this year, and we have a potential date for one cool thing coming up, which I think is important. We need to firm it up, but I think it's fair enough we can approximately lay it out. But in October, we should be doing a really fun conversation about a common subject for Terry and I talk about, which is planning your preaching and how we go about it. We've got some willy-nilly random do whatever you want guys who are going to, come set us straight. I think maybe, actually, no, I think it'll be a fun investigation. And I suspect that the appearance of not planning isn't exactly what's taking place. I think there's probably a superficial outside of this, have a new subject every week, when really they probably are planning more than they let on. And we might say, but I'll tell you, it doesn't matter. I'm still going to drop the anchor on them and salute the ship as it falls.
I'm just going to sit back and laugh at all of you. So I'm looking forward to October the 12th.
Right. And if Terry can't show up, then I've got a ringer in the backseat that's already willing to come in.
Did you talk to Mark Roberts? Is that what you did? We can have 5 people on, and I can sit back and just be I'll be the
if Mark Roberts comes, I don't have to do anything other than press buttons.
Yeah. If Mark Robert comes, we just wind that up and let it go. I mean, that's we just sit back. I could be the facilitator for the rest of y'all.
It's kind of like drafting Barkley into a U10 league. It's not like for the rest of us.
Yeah, you got it, buddy. Although let's at least acknowledge Mark's a little hurt right now. He's an Ohio State fan, so we need to let him recover before we before we go on.
I got to stand strong. Although I am actually agnostic in regards to team preference. I do have some strong allegiances in this household to both Tennessee and Oregon teams, and so a little sweet and sour in the relationships. Last thoughts, Terry, before we close out for today.
I just thanks for joining us. That's my last thoughts. It's always good to be with the people.
More immediately than that October lesson, we're going to have a conversation coming up about what about Logos Sermon Builder, what about toxic topics, that I think is a little thing I'm throwing in there in the future, and Terry will learn about that as we get closer to it. It's a P.W. Martin topic, but also about what about making your workbook work, some stuff that I think are important for all of us. And if you've got questions, I'm just light it on fire and burn it all down. So we'll see how things go. But those are things to look on the agenda. And regarding that special segment of adversarial conversation, we'll let you know the date as it gets a little closer. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. And if we can help you in your work, just let us know. Take care.